They say you don't know what you've got until it's gone, but they never tell you what it feels like when the thing that's gone is 50 years of war you never spoke aloud, tossed into a county dump by someone who shares your blood. My name is Benjamin. I'm 76 years old, and the morning my daughter threw away my army trunk, she didn't just throw away medals and photographs. She threw away a story that a museum curator was about to call and tell me the whole country needed to hear. Benjamin is a Vietnam veteran. For 50 years, he kept his war locked in an olive footlocker. Medals, letters, faces of men who never came home. His daughter saw junk. She threw it all away. But that trunk held something so rare that a museum curator spent weeks tracking him down to save it. This is that story. I need you to understand who I was before the trunk, because the man I am now started the moment I realized it was gone. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where you either joined the military or you worked at the factory, and I did both. I enlisted at 19. Vietnam took me in 1968 and spit me out in 1970, and I came home to a country that didn't want to look at me, so I stopped looking at myself. I buried everything in that footlocker, the Bronze Star, the commendation letter. Photographs of my unit, boys whose names I still say out loud when I can't sleep. I locked it all away because the past was a room I couldn't walk out of twice. For 5 decades, that trunk sat in the corner of my garage under a tarp, and I never once opened it in front of my daughter. Nancy was born in 1974, after the war, after the silence had already set in. She grew up knowing her father served, but never knowing what that meant. She saw an old man who kept a dirty trunk full of paper that smelled like mothballs and rust. She didn't see the Silver Star citation for gallantry in action. She didn't see the letter from a medic thanking me for pulling him out of a rice paddy. She saw clutter, and I never corrected her because I didn't know how. Nancy is a good person. I want that on the record. She's organized, practical, the kind of woman who reads Marie Kondo books and believes that if something doesn't spark joy, it belongs in a landfill. In April of this year, she decided to give my garage what she called a necessary intervention. I was out buying tomato plants. When I came back, the corner was empty. The tarp was folded on the workbench. The trunk was gone. I asked her where it was. She said, "Dad, I took it to the dump. It was just old junk. You never look at it." She said it gently, the way you tell someone you've done them a favor. I didn't yell. I couldn't. I just stood there in the garage with my hands at my sides and felt 50 years of silence collapse into a single hollowed-out space in my chest. But here's what Nancy didn't know. The county dump has a reclamation partner, a non-profit that sifts through discarded items for anything of value before it hits the landfill. Volunteers go through the trash. And that same afternoon, a man named Dr. Alan Kirchhoff, a curator for the National Military History Museum, happened to be on site, looking through a pile of recently dropped debris. He saw the olive footlocker with my name stenciled on the side. He opened it, and what he found inside made his hands shake, because among the medals and photographs was a document that didn't belong to just any veteran. It was a unit citation so rare that only 12 were ever issued. And the name on it was mine. The phone rang at 7:15 on a Tuesday evening. I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize the number, and I've spent 50 years dodging calls from people who want to sell me extended warranties. But something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was measured, careful, the kind of voice that has to deliver important news and hasn't figured out how yet. He introduced himself as Dr. Alan Kirchhoff, curator of military collections at the National Military History Museum. He said he'd found something addressed to me, something he believed I'd want back. I remember standing in my kitchen, holding the phone with one hand and gripping the counter with the other. I said, "You found my trunk?" He said, "Yes, sir, and I need to tell you what's inside it." He started with the medals: Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor Device, Purple Heart with Oak Leaf Cluster. I knew those were there. Then he mentioned the photographs, the letters, and then he paused. He said, "Mr. Coleman, do you know what a presidential unit citation is?" I said I did. He said, "There's one in your trunk. The original citation document, signed, issued to your battalion for actions in February 1968. Only 12 of these were ever issued for that operation. 12. And yours is the only original in private hands that we've ever been able to locate." I sat down, not dramatically, just the slow sinking of a man whose legs have been asked to hold up 60 years of weight, and finally said no more. He kept talking, but I was somewhere else. I was back in the jungle. I was 20 years old. I was watching men I loved walk into fire, and not all of them walk out. And I had locked that away so tightly that I forgot the trunk held something that mattered beyond my own memory, something that mattered to history. Dr. Kirchhoff asked if he could come see me. He offered to bring the trunk himself, but he also wanted to talk about preservation. The museum, he explained, had a climate-controlled vault where documents like these could be protected indefinitely. They wanted to build an exhibit. Not just about me, he said, about the men in those photographs, the ones who didn't come home. He wanted their stories. He wanted my voice. I told him I'd think about it. What I didn't tell him was that I hadn't spoken about the war to anyone, not my wife before she passed, not my daughter, not my grandchildren, in half a century. The words had been locked in that trunk alongside the medals. 3 days later, he arrived at my door with the trunk in the back of his station wagon. He was younger than I expected, maybe late 50s, with glasses and the kind of quiet reverence you see in people who spend their lives handling other people's ghosts. He opened the trunk on my dining room table, and for the first time since 1970, I saw everything laid out. The Silver Star citation I'd never framed. The letter from the mother of a boy named David Crozier, thanking me for being with him when he died. The unit citation, yellowed but legible, with a seal that made Dr. Kirchhoff's eyes go soft. He said, "This belongs in a museum, but more importantly, it belongs to your family. They need to know what you did." I told him my daughter thought it was junk. He said, "Then let's change her mind." What happened next happened faster than I could process. The museum issued a press release. A local news station picked it up. Vietnam veterans lost valor saved from landfill. The headline felt like someone had taken my chest and turned it inside out. Strangers were calling. Neighbors I'd nodded at for 20 years suddenly wanted to shake my hand. And Nancy, my daughter, saw the story on the evening news. I didn't hear from her for 2 days. That silence was heavier than the trunk had ever been. When she finally showed up at my door, her face was blotched from crying. She stood on my porch, and she couldn't look at me. She said, "Dad, I threw your life away." She said it like a confession, like the words had been burning a hole in her throat since the moment the news anchor read my name. I pulled her inside. I didn't say it was okay because it wasn't. I said, "You didn't know. And the reason you didn't know is because I never told you." That was the moment I realized the silence I'd kept for 50 years hadn't protected anyone. It had just passed the wound down. The museum scheduled a dedication ceremony. They invited my entire family. They invited the families of the men in those photographs. And for the first time, my grandchildren, all 4 of them under the age of 15, would see their grandfather not as an old man with a flannel shirt and a quiet laugh, but as a soldier who had carried his friends through hell and never once asked for a thank you. But something still didn't sit right with me. The trunk had been mine for 50 years. It held things I wasn't ready to give away. The curator understood. He offered to make high-quality copies for the exhibit and leave the originals with me, preserved in a fireproof case the museum would provide. I agreed. The originals would stay with me. The copies would tell the story. And that's when I made a decision that would change everything. I decided that before the dedication, before the cameras, before the public, I would sit down in my living room with my grandchildren and open the trunk myself. I would tell them about David Crozier, about the night we earned that unit citation, about the sound of rain on a poncho and the weight of a friend's hand going still. I would tell them, finally, who their grandfather really was. The ceremony was in 3 days. The trunk was back in my house, resting on the coffee table, and my daughter Nancy, the one who threw it away, asked if she could be there when I told the stories. I said yes. Not because the past was fixed, but because the future was finally open enough to hold it. But here's the thing. The museum wasn't the only one who'd been looking into my trunk, and the next call I got was not about history. It was about a debt I thought had been forgotten 40 years ago. The man on the phone introduced himself as Thomas Ackley. The name meant nothing to me at first. He said his father was William Ackley, a medic with the 1st Battalion, 26th Infantry. He said it slowly, giving me time to place the name. And then I did. Billy Ackley, the man who had pulled me out of a burning personnel carrier in 1969. The man whose hands I still felt on my ribs when I breathed too deep. Billy had died in 1998, I knew that. But his son was on the phone, and his voice was calm in a way that made me nervous. He said, "Mr. Coleman, I saw the news about your trunk. I saw the unit citation. I need to ask you something. Did my father ever tell you about a promise he wanted you to keep?" I closed my eyes. The question landed exactly where decades of silence had built the thickest walls. I said I didn't know what he meant. He said, "There's a letter in that trunk from my father. If it's still there, I need to know what it says." I hadn't looked through everything. Dr. Kirchhoff had catalogued the medals and official documents, but the personal letters I'd kept sealed for 50 years. Billy had written me a letter just before he shipped home. I'd never opened it. I told Thomas I would look. He said he'd wait. The trunk was on the coffee table. I opened it again, and this time I wasn't just seeing my own history. I was looking for someone else's. I found the letter at the bottom, inside an envelope yellowed and soft as old linen. My name was written in Billy's handwriting, the same careful loops I remembered from the notes he left on supply requests. I opened it. The paper was thin. The words were still sharp. Billy wrote that he was going home to his wife and a son he'd never met. He wrote that he was scared, not of dying, but of being forgotten. He wrote that the only thing he wanted was for someone to tell his boy that his father had been brave. And then, near the end, a sentence I had to read 3 times because it refused to stay still on the page. He wrote, "Benny, you're the only one who knows what I really did. I can't carry it alone. If I'm gone before you find Thomas, tell him the truth. Tell him his father didn't save you. You saved me, and I've been living on borrowed honor ever since." I dropped the letter. Thomas Ackley was still on the phone, breathing quietly. I asked him how much he knew about his father's service. He said he grew up hearing stories about Billy the hero, the medic who was awarded a Bronze Star for pulling men out of a burning vehicle. He said those stories had held his family together after Billy died, and I realized that for 30 years I'd let a lie stand because I thought it protected something beautiful. In February 1969, our convoy was ambushed. The first rocket hit the vehicle in front of me. The second hit mine. I was pinned, and Billy was in the same wreckage. He wasn't the one who pulled me out. I was the one who got him out. I dragged him through fire while fragments carved into my back. The Bronze Star citation in my trunk, it was for that action. Billy had been there, but he was unconscious when they found us. The story flipped somewhere in the chaos, and Billy had let it. He'd spent the rest of his life wearing a medal that belonged to me, and he'd asked me in that letter to tell his son the truth. Thomas said he wanted to meet. He said he wasn't angry. He just wanted to know who his father really was. I told him to come to the ceremony. I told him that some truths take 50 years to find their voice, but they still deserve to be spoken. That night, I sat alone with the trunk. It held not just my war, but Billy's ghost. It held a medal citation that would now need to be corrected. It held the fragile possibility that history could be told honestly, even if it shattered a family's memory. I called Dr. Kirchhoff. I told him there was something else in the trunk that needed cataloging: the truth. He said the museum's job was to preserve history, not to protect comfortable stories. He asked if I was ready. I said I didn't know, but I knew the choice wasn't mine anymore. The next morning, Nancy came over with her children. They sat on my couch, and I opened the trunk again. I started with the photographs. I told them about each face, each name. I told them about the night we earned the unit citation, the rain, the radio call that came in garbled, the decision I made that saved 15 men but cost 2. And then I told them about Billy. I told them that honor isn't about what metal you wear. It's about what you're willing to give up so that someone else can keep their dignity. My grandson asked me why I never told these stories before. I said because I was scared that speaking them would make them real again. And I realized that silence had been its own kind of war, and I'd been losing it for 50 years. The dedication ceremony was a day away. The museum had built a display case with my name and Billy's name together. Dr. Kirchhoff had arranged for Thomas Ackley to stand with me. I was going to hand him the original Bronze Star citation and tell the assembled crowd exactly who had earned it. I didn't know if Thomas would accept it. I didn't know if I'd be able to finish the sentence. But I knew that the trunk was not a box of medals. It was a box of stories that had been waiting for a witness. And tomorrow, for the first time, the witness would be everyone. The morning of the ceremony, I woke up at 4:30 and couldn't fall back asleep. I stood in my bathroom and looked at the face in the mirror, a face I'd spent 50 years trying not to see. I shaved. I put on the one suit I owned. I pinned the silver star to my lapel, my fingers shaking. I was afraid of a lot of things in my life. I was afraid of dying in a jungle 8,000 miles from home. I was afraid of losing my wife too young, but I had never been afraid of a room full of people until that morning. The museum had set up a small auditorium. Dr. Kirchhoff told me there'd be maybe 60 people. When I walked in, there were over 200. Veterans in VFW caps, families with children holding little American flags. A news crew with cameras that followed me like silent predators. Nancy stood near the front with my grandchildren, her face pale and still, her eyes rimmed red. She hadn't slept either. Thomas Ackley was in the second row. I'd never met him before, but I recognized his father's jaw, his father's stillness. He nodded at me, and I nodded back, and that was all the communication two men who'd inherited a heavy story needed. Dr. Kirchhoff spoke first. He talked about the trunk, about what it contained, about the rarity of the unit citation. He said the museum was honored to preserve these artifacts. Then he called me to the podium. The walk-up felt longer than any patrol I'd ever walked in the jungle. I gripped the edges of the wooden lectern and looked out at a sea of faces waiting for me to speak. I'd rehearsed nothing. I opened my mouth and let 50 years of silence finally end. I told them about David Crozier, who died in my arms singing a song his mother taught him. I told them about the night we earned that citation, the mud and the noise, and the way a man's voice sounds when he knows he's not going home. I told them about the photographs, the faces of boys who never became old men. And then I said the hardest thing. I said that one of those boys, William Ackley, had lived a life carrying a medal he didn't earn. He'd worn it because the story flipped in the smoke, and he was too ashamed to correct it. I said that I didn't want his memory to be a lie. I wanted his son to know his father wasn't a hero in the way the world measures it, but he was a man who tried. And sometimes trying is the only thing any of us can really do. I pulled the Bronze Star citation from my jacket and held it up. The room was so quiet I could hear the camera zoom in. I said this belongs to Billy Ackley's family because his father paid for it with a lifetime of guilt. I'm handing it back. I stepped off the podium and walked directly to Thomas Ackley. He stood up. His eyes were wet, but his face was composed in the way that men who have learned to carry complicated grief always are. I placed the citation in his hands. He held it for a long moment, looking at his father's name, then at me. He said quiet enough that only I could hear, "Thank you for giving me my father, the real one." I couldn't speak. I just squeezed his shoulder and walked back. Nancy was crying openly now. My youngest grandson, 7 years old, was holding her hand without fully understanding why. After the ceremony, she found me near the exhibit case, which now held copies of the citations and photographs alongside a small placard with my name and the story of the trunk's recovery. She threw her arms around me and held on like I might disappear. She said, "Dad, I am so sorry. I didn't know. I should have asked." I said, "You couldn't have known. I never told you. That's my fault, not yours." She pulled back and said, "But I should have seen it wasn't junk. I should have seen you." That was the sentence that broke something loose in my chest, because she was right. We had both been blind to each other's wars. Later that evening, the museum held a private reception for the families. I met the widow of a man whose photograph I'd carried in my wallet for 40 years. She told me she'd always wondered about the faces in her husband's unit. I showed her the photo. She touched the glass and said, "There he is, right where he belonged." The children of fallen soldiers came up to me and asked for stories, and I gave them every one I could remember. The trunk, it turned out, didn't just belong to me. It belonged to all of them. At the end of the night, Dr. Kirchhoff walked me back to the exhibit case. He asked if I was happy with how the originals would be stored. I told him I was. The fireproof case I'd be taking home was heavier than I expected, a small safe really, with foam cut precisely to hold each document and medal. He said, "Before you lock it up, there's one more thing you should see." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small leather pouch I'd never seen before. He said it was found in the lining of the trunk, wedged between the wood and the canvas. I opened it. Inside was a brass key and a slip of paper with an address I didn't recognize. And on the back of the paper, in handwriting I hadn't seen since 1968, the words, "If you're reading this, Benny, I didn't make it. Please go home for me." It was signed by a man named Samuel Hale, a boy I'd shared a foxhole with, a boy I'd watched disappear into a helicopter and never saw again. I'd carried his final wish in the bottom of my trunk for 50 years without ever knowing it existed. And tomorrow, I was going to keep it. Samuel Hale's family lived in a small town in Pennsylvania I'd never been to. I drove there 3 weeks later with the brass key in my pocket and the slip of paper on the passenger seat. His sister answered the door. She was 82 years old. I told her I'd served with Sam. I handed her the key and said I didn't know what it unlocked, but Sam had wanted me to bring it home. She took it in both hands and just stood there, holding something her brother had touched 50 years ago. We cried together on the porch. That key didn't open a lock. It opened a door that war had closed. Here, what I learned when my daughter threw away my army trunk. We don't keep things because they spark joy. We keep them because they hold the weight of people who can't speak for themselves anymore. A box of old medals is never just a box of old medals. It's a map of who we were and a compass for who we still might become. I'd spent half a century believing silence was protection. It was. It was just a slower way of losing everything. The trunk is back in my house now, but it doesn't sit in the garage under a tarp. It sits in my living room, and I open it for anyone who asks. My grandchildren know the names of men they'll never meet. My daughter knows her father wasn't a ghost. And somewhere in Pennsylvania, an old woman keeps a brass key on her mantle that means her brother finally made it home. If this story meant something to you, do what I didn't do for 50 years. Tell someone, share it. And if you want more stories about what happens when the past refuses to stay buried, hit that subscribe button. You never know what you're sitting on until someone forces you to open the lid. Thank you for listening. My name is Benjamin, and this is my story.